Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on navigating Nordic standards with smarter PSA technologies. Today's session is designed as a practical guide for both OEMs and converters who work in or supply to the Nordic region. Sustainability expectations there are often more advanced and more explicit than in many other markets. Now, today's focus is on what this means specifically for adhesive and tape solutions. How do regulations, eco-labels, and procurement practices shape material choices? And how can new solvent-free technologies help meet both performance and sustainability requirements? Note that this is a hybrid session today, so part is pre-recorded, but we'll handle your questions live via the chat. The deck will be shared after the session. Now, before we get started, let me briefly introduce our speakers. Sustainability Director Anne Vergaert will kick us off by setting the context with the Nordic policy landscape. Johan Poelmans will cover how sustainability shows up in specifications and real applications. Then Jan Golasewski will walk us through the technology principles and decision logic. And my name is Rachel Jacobs, and I'm your moderator for today. We've structured the session for you today, and we'll start off with the Nordic regulations and sustainability drivers. After which, we'll move into how those expectations appear in specifications and RFQs. Now from there, we'll take a look at industry-specific applications before we dive into the adhesive technology principles. We'll then introduce a practical decision tree to help select sustainable adhesive solutions, followed by the key takeaways. Now along the way, we'll run a few short polls to make this a little more interactive and to benchmark what you are seeing in your own projects. Those will then be shown on the right-hand side of your screen, and we really encourage you to participate in these polls as much as possible. Now, if you have any questions yourself during the presentation, please feel free to add them in the chat as we go, and we'll try to answer them during the session. Now, if we cannot get to all of them today, we'll reach out to you after the webinar. With that, I'll hand it over to Anne to get us started.
Thank you, Rachel. When we talk about sustainability in the Nordics, we are not talking about a trend or a nice to have. No, in this region, sustainability expectations are deeply embedded into regulation, procurement, and design decisions, and they directly influence which materials are accepted or rejected. The Nordic countries, they move earlier and more decisively than the rest of Europe. What is optional elsewhere quickly becomes expected here. And that is why understanding this regulatory landscape is so important when selecting adhesive and tape solutions. At a strategic level, everything starts with the Nordic Vision 2030. The Nordic countries have the shared ambition to become the most sustainable and integrated region in the world. And there are 5 key elements. First, climate neutral and circular design, climate neutral production, renewable materials, and circular principles, they are already shaping the buyer expectations today. Second is green innovation, with the government investing strongly in green innovation. This makes the Nordics an early adoption market for new sustainable technologies. Third is a harmonization of shared standards and transparency, creating a common sustainability baseline across the countries. Social sustainability also plays a role, with ethical sourcing, worker safety, and transparency directly linked to long-term brand trust. And because of this, we see global influence through Nordic example. Nordic solutions often serve as a testbed. Solutions that work here tend to anticipate what later becomes standard in other regions. When we translate that vision into day-to-day material decisions, 4 non-negotiables consistently come back. The first is embodied carbon. There is a growing pressure to reduce the CO2 emissions across the full product life cycle. Second is health. Excellent indoor air quality and very low VOC emissions are essential, especially in occupied spaces. Chemical management is another key pillar, with a clear expectation to reduce hazards and promote safer installations by design. And then finally, transparency. Clear documentation and traceability are expected to support faster approvals, audits, and procurement decisions. So together, these 4 principles explain why material selection in the Nordic countries often feels more demanding than in other markets. From here, the focus shifts from policy principles to concrete regulatory frameworks. And this is where sustainability expectations become enforceable requirements that directly affect adhesive formulations, documentation, and installation practices. Let's have a look. REACH, as part of the European Green Deal, is the central European framework for chemical safety, and it's fully adopted across all Nordic countries, but often with stricter local enforcement. There are 3 mechanisms that are particularly relevant for adhesives. First, the substances of very high concern candidate list. This requires continuous monitoring and transparent communication across the supply chain. Second is the authorization under Annex 14 that pushes the phase-out of certain substances unless explicit approval is granted. And third, the restrictions under Annex 17 prohibit specific uses, like the isocyanates being a well-known recent example. For adhesives, this creates very concrete implications. All raw materials must be REACH registered and traceable. The safety data sheets and authorization records must be complete and fully up to date. Substances of very high concern updates require proactive substitution planning because last-minute reformulation doesn't work in our industry. And in some specific chemistries, the mandatory training becomes part of the compliance burden, like with the diisocyanates. Beyond regulation, environmental labels play a major role in the Nordic region. They are often embedded directly into specifications and public procurement criteria, so they are certainly not treated as an optional add-on. The Nordic Swan Ecolabel is the official environmental certification in the region and is the leading Type 1 eco-label under the ISO 14024. It evaluates products across their full life cycle and is frequently referenced in public tenders and green building projects. So what does this now mean for adhesives and tapes? These criteria strongly favor solvent-free, low-emission solutions with verified life cycle performance. Full ingredient transparency is required, and designs that support circularity are actively encouraged. The label also drives the adoption of eco-innovative bonding technologies that balance sustainability with performance, like our solvent-free solutions. The key message is simple. Adhesives and tapes that align with Nordic Swan expectations gain a clear advantage in procurement and approval processes. Now, let's have a look at a summary per country. So, summarizing per country, Finland. For Finland, indoor air quality is central, with the M1 certification widely expected for building adhesives, and there is strong emphasis on emission testing. Sweden leads on the elimination and the transparency of harmful chemicals, embedding Nordic Swan criteria into public procurement. Denmark also places strong focus on indoor air quality, but also asking for embodied carbon documentation and has a clear preference for low-odor, low-emission solutions. Norway aligns both with Sweden and European standards, emphasizing life cycle data and also carbon accounting in procurement decisions. So while details differ, the overall direction across the region is really very consistent. So this brings us to our first poll of the webinar, and I'll hand it over to Rachel.
Thank you, Anne. So please take a look at the right-hand side to locate the poll and fill in your answer. We'd like to hear from you. What is driving decisions in your own projects today? Is it compliance and safety? Indoor air quality? Sustainability credentials such as the Nordic Swan? Or CO2 footprint and circularity? Let's keep those answers in mind as we move to the next chapter, where Johan will explain how these expectations translate directly into specifications and RFQs.
Thanks Rachel, and hi everyone, it's great to be here. So let's dive into this new topic. Now that sustainability expectations are clear at a regulatory and policy level, we want to know how they end up in our daily work. For most teams, this happens through specifications, RFQs, and tender documents. We see more often that sustainability and performance are evaluated together, often by different stakeholders, but within the same approval process. And this has a direct impact on how adhesive solutions are selected, validated, and documented. To put this in perspective, we identified 4 pillars in how sustainability and performance show up in specs and RFQ documents. The first pillar is emission and compliance. On the compliance side, properties like low VOC, odor and fogging emissions are gaining importance. Customers want to have a proof of concept, and that's why upfront, emission and carbon footprint data are now essential, especially in the construction market and public procurement. Certifications like M1, EC1+, and Nordic Swan are often mandatory in specs. The second pillar addresses installation and performance. Here, there's a clear preference for low VOC, low odor and solvent-free products, especially in occupied or enclosed spaces. A clean installation isn't just safer, it also speeds up audits and site approvals. As designs become lighter and mix more materials, bonding to difficult plastics like polypropylene and polyethylene is critical. Transparency is a third major theme. Safety data sheets, ingredient transparency, sustainability and recyclability statements are requested more frequently in this team. So a well-structured test data speeds up reviews and accelerates the qualification process. The last pillar are the specifier preferences. Specifiers prefer pre-cured solutions like PSA tapes because they eliminate on-site fumes, they simplify training and lower the installation risk. Label compliance and proven material compatibility will accelerate the approvals. As we close this chapter, Rachel will conduct a poll now to find out which you find the most important feature to speed up your projects. The floor is yours, Rachel.
Thank you, Johan. As we close this topic, let's take some time to reflect by means of another poll. So again, please click on your choice on the right-hand side. Where do you see the biggest opportunity to speed up your projects? Is it the time needed for emission testing and validation? The effort required to gather documentation and get approvals? Uncertainty around material compatibility? The operational burden of installation training? Or perhaps a good coordination across different stakeholders? Thank you for taking the time to provide your answer. Johan will now continue with some industry-specific applications.
Thank you, Rachel. Now that we've seen how sustainability and performance requirements appear in specs and RFQs, it's helpful to look at how this plays a role across different industries. While the regulatory framework is shared, the priorities can be different depending on the application. Let's have a look at where the Nordic sustainability standards are changing the adhesive choices of today. We have here an industry map combined with specific risk drivers. In Scandinavia, we've selected 4 major industries and applications to dive into. The first one is automotive, interiors and noise vibration harshness solutions. Here, the chemical compliance and traceability are non-negotiable. There's also a very strong focus on ultra-low VOC, fogging and odor performance, combined with an increasing request for carbon footprint transparency. Here, materials must perform consistently over a long lifetime and under varying temperature conditions. Secondly, in building and construction, especially acoustics and HVAC applications, the indoor air quality certifications such as M1, EC1 Plus and the Nordic Swan are frequently required. Public tenders clearly favor low VOC, solvent-free products, and there's a strong demand for transparent emission data and validation to support approvals. For electronics and instrumentation, the material restrictions drive many decisions. So substances of very high concern content, flame retardant restrictions, low outgassing requirements are critical, particularly for optical and sensor applications. Sustainability is now a part of the qualification process. Lastly, in industrial gaskets and sealing, REACH-driven compliance and training requirements are pushing a shift towards solvent-free pre-cured systems. You need a consistent performance in any environment. Up to this point, we've talked about sustainability and performance in specs and how industries have their own specific risk drivers. But let's look at what happens on the actual assembly floor. When comparing a liquid adhesive to a pre-cured tape-based solution, the sustainability and operational differences become very clear. While a liquid adhesive typically emits VOCs and odors during the application, they often require personal protective equipment, ventilation and extra curing time, which makes the installation harder and less predictable. Also, the application thickness can differ, putting your performance at risk. Tape solutions, on the other hand, enable low emission and odor-free installation. They deliver a uniform bond thickness, are easier to handle, supporting a more consistent result. Because no curing time is required, they offer immediate strength after the application, which simplifies the assembly and speeds up production. In the Nordics, where safety, clean installation and indoor air quality comes first, these factors are often the deal breaker. To close this topic, now heads up for a new poll. We are curious in finding out where you face the biggest challenges in your application. Go ahead, Rachel.
Thank you, Johan. To close this chapter, we have a new question in the poll for you. Please click on what you would say is the biggest challenge in your application currently. Is it meeting increasingly strict VOC and odor emission requirements? Or perhaps it's managing chemical compliance and documentation across the supply chain? Or ensuring consistent bond performance across different substrates? Or maybe reducing installation time and on-site complexity? Thank you for your answers. We'll now move on to Jan, who will take us through the technology principles behind solvent-free and advanced acrylic solutions.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and now let's move to the technology chapter. And this chapter is all about the fact that you can have both. You can have a performance as well as sustainability when it comes to adhesive. But there is only one condition. You have to start very early at the development process. And in fact, in Avery Dennison, we are fully in control of such process. We start to develop our adhesive at the molecular level. We make them from the scratch. We pick the right raw materials and we pick the right technology. And by doing so, we can modify our adhesive, we can modify the performance, as well as we can modify the impact on the environment. In fact, in Avery Dennison, what we do is we're coating zillions and zillions of square meters every day of pressure sensitive materials, including performance tapes. And thanks to it, we can come up with a very consistent quality. Every day we are working with thousands of converters. And these converters, by using state-of-the-art technology, slitting, cutting, laminating, they come up with application ready-made parts. And they pass it to OEM, and the OEM, they verify them and they appreciate constructions made with our tapes. Now, let me tell you more. How did we develop those adhesives which are sustainable? There are many ways of producing adhesives and there are many technologies. There is solvent technology, emulsion, UV and hot melt. To produce the adhesive you can use all kinds of chemicals and they all have their own advantages and disadvantages. And everybody on the market knows that when it comes to performance, the best adhesives are acrylic adhesives. They are the most resistant, they are the most durable and the most desired. However, it's common knowledge that acrylic solvents are the worst when it comes to the impact on the environment. And for this particular reason, we did our best to come up alternatives to the solvent acrylics. And we come up with solvent-free UV acrylic, advanced acrylics, and solvent-free UV modified acrylics. And let me tell you more about them. Now let's concentrate on solvent-free UV acrylic. We have two types of them in Avery Dennison. There is a permanent type, and the tape made out of this adhesive or made with this adhesive has a code 77400. And another tape, removable, has a code 73312. And let's concentrate more on the solvent-free UV modified acrylic. When we look at their performance, they perform as well as any other solvent acrylic out there on the market. Their resistance to water, to temperature, to chemical and UV is just as good as any other. And the tapes made with these adhesives are very easy at conversion and they are durable across all kinds of applications. However, when we look at the sustainability, these adhesives are very good when it comes to the carbon dioxide emission. They are very low, about 20 to 30% lower than any adhesive there on the market. They are very low at VOC emission and they have only about 40 particles per millions in comparison with about 10,000 when it comes to solvent acrylics from the market. This adhesive is fully in accordance with any EU regulations. So it's in accordance with the EU Green Deal as well as chemical strategy goals. So you can see that this particular adhesive is it's equally good at performance and sustainability. Now, this particular slide shows how adhesives are being produced. You have 3 diagrams here, And when you look at the first diagram, it shows the solvent acrylic. To produce solvent acrylic, you mix the monomer with solvent, and you come up with a finished polymer. And this polymer is soaking in the solvent, like toluene. And then you put this adhesive on a coater, and you evaporate the solvents by using heat. So what happens is that this solvent, one way or another, ends up in the environment. Now, when you look at, for example, productions of conventional UV hot melt, you're mixing monomer with solvent, and then you remove the solvent before coating process. You come up with a finished polymer, but in this polymer still there is 1% of solvent. And only afterwards you put it on a coater by using UV light. You dry up the adhesive, you cross-linking it, you come up with a tape. But again, this tape still evaporates solvent from the adhesive. And now let us have a look at the solvent-free UV acrylics, the one which we developed in Avery Dennison. In this particular case, at the very bottom, look at the very bottom of our diagram. In this particular case, you take a monomer, and then you purify this monomer, you purify the polymer by using the steam. Then you come up with a polymer which is pure, without any traces of toluene or solvent and other hazardous substance, and then you put it on a coater by using the UV light. You're drying up, and you come up with a tape. And as you can see, the whole process is solvent-free. There is no any solvent there. There is no any hazardous substances, and this is why we are so proud of Avery Dennison and of Avery Dennison developing this particular adhesive. Now then, let's have a look at the examples of tapes with this particular solvent-free UV modified acrylic. Now, the first example which I want to show you, it's a tape 77400. It's a double-coated tape, all right, and it was made particularly for foam and fiber market, and it's very good at low surface energy substrates. When we look at the construction of this adhesive, this tape is completely sustainable. It has a solvent-free adhesive. It has a recycled liner as well as recycled carrier made from non-woven fibers. However, when we look at the performance of this adhesive, we can say that very often it overperforms available products on the market, especially when it comes to high initial tack, and especially when it comes to the resistance, to the repulsion resistance and mechanical stress. So if you have a tape there which you want to apply, for example, on a cylindrical surface or on a round surface, then this is a tape made for you. And another tape, removable, has a code 73312. And let's concentrate more on the solvent-free UV modified acrylic. When we look at their performance, they perform as well as any other solvent acrylic out there on the market. Their resistance to water, to temperature, to chemical and UV is just as good as any other. And the tapes made with these adhesives are very easy at conversion, and they are durable across all kinds of applications. Go further, and advanced acrylics. Advanced acrylics are another example of our sustainable products. The tape which is made from this adhesive is 21302. When we look closer at this particular adhesive, again, on the performance side, it's as good as any other on the market. It's equally, and the tapes made from this adhesive are equally good at conversions and durable. However, when you look at the sustainability, this particular adhesive has a very low emission of carbon dioxide, 20 to 30% lower. It is extra low when it comes to VOC, volatile organic compounds emission, and it is odor. It's without any odor. Now, when we additionally, this adhesive is completely in alignment with the EU Green Deal and chemical strategy goals. Another example of an adhesive which combines the performance with the sustainability. Now, let me tell you, how do we produce it? You have to look at the bottom of this slide, and then you see the diagram. And in this diagram, right, when we develop this advanced acrylic, we combine the monomer with water. We're coming up with polymer, and this polymer is without any solvents, without any hazardous substances. We put it on the coater, and then the emulsion is being evaporated, the water is being evaporated, and what happens is we're coming up with adhesive which is very sustainable. Right, in this particular case, the monomer which we are using, it's specially designed, and it's different than the one which are being used on the market, because this particular monomer allows us to come up with an adhesive which is very temperature resistant, and additionally it has a very high shear performance. Now let's have a look at an example of a tape, and which is made with this solvent advanced acrylic 21302. This particular tape was made for the graphic market, for security labels, for holograms, and for displays, graphic displays, banners. Now, when we look at constructions, it is completely sustainable. It has an environmental friendly adhesive, and the liner is made from recycled fibers. When we look at the performance is as good as any other solvent acrylic on the market. However, we have here, in this particular case, very high temperature resistance as well as very high shear performance. And again, it's one more example of combining sustainability with the performance. And now let me pass you over to my friend Rachel, who will carry out a survey for you.
Thank you, Jan. Before we continue, it's useful to understand which performance attributes are most critical in your applications. So please head over to the polls section and indicate whether high temperature resistance is the most important, chemical resistance, long-term durability, or is it perhaps consistent converting behavior? These priorities directly influence which technology platform is the best fit. And that leads us into the next chapter on decision trees and solution patterns. Back to you, Jan.
Right, thank you so much, Rachel, and now let's move to another chapter. And so far we have covered regulations, applications, sustainability, but up to now we overloaded you with a lot of information. And the problem is how to find the right tape for the right project. And in order to do it, you have to start to concentrate on priorities and on criteria. The best way to do it is to go through this decision criteria process. So you have 5 stages of this decision criteria process, and it all starts with the first stage, which is function. At this moment, you have to ask yourself what this tape, which you're looking for, needs to do for you. You have to think whether it has to be a protective tape, whether it have to be electroconductive tape, whether it will be tape for NVH, or it's just a tape which needs to combine two surfaces together. After that, you have to turn to a substrate. You have to think what this substrate on which you have to apply tape is like. Is it flat or is it curved? Is it clean or contaminated? Is it a low surface energy substrate or a high surface energy substrate? Or maybe it's EPDM, which is greasy, wet, and is evaporating some kind of plasticizers which will damage the adhesive. Nextly, you have to review the environment, and the first thing which stands out is temperature. You have to think what should be the resistance of this temperature. You have to think whether the whole constructions will be applied in a humid conditions, whether it will be exposed to chemicals, UV light, on how long it needs to stay on a particular surface. Then you have to look to compliance. So when you look to the environmental compliance, you can easily apply our solvent acrylics, but you might also review some other compliances. So for example, safety, for example, medical compliances, and for example, the quality assurance compliances. Finally, you have to review the operations. You have to think how these constructions with our tape will be applied at OEM level. Right? Is it going to be manually applied or automatically? And if it's automatically applied, what will be the speed? And there might be some other requirements of OEM. For example, this constructions has to be printed with a barcode, it has to be printed with let's say the identification number. Now, let's put this criteria process into a bit of a practice. Let's assume that you have to develop an applications which you see on this picture. These are covers for the newly built cars. So if you go through this criteria and you start with a function, you come to conclusion that you might want to have a differential tape. On one side it has to be removable, and the other side permanent. Then you need to look at the substrate. So here, in this particular case, on one side you have the painted car metal, and on the other side you have probably polyethylene. The cover probably is made from cheap polyethylene, which might be very sort of challenging when you're applying the adhesive. When you look at the environment, here, right, most likely high temperature resistance is not going to be needed. That's probably not the requirement of this application. However, you must consider the weather conditions, because this cover will be exposed to the sunlight, will be exposed to humidity, will be exposed to some kind of contamination like dust. Next, you have to look at the compliance stage, and let's assume that this particular product will be used in the Nordic countries, so you might consider the M1 or EC1 norms, which are in Finland and in Denmark. And finally, the OEM may decide or may require for this application to be applied quickly and easily in an efficient way, and that it must be odor-free. We hope that when you go through this decision criteria, you will come to the immediate conclusion that the best tape for this application would be 73312. And now, let's us end this chapter and move to Rachel, who will carry out the last survey of this webinar.
Thank you, Jan. Before we move on to the key takeaways, it's useful to reflect on where your own decision-making typically starts. So for this last poll, please let us know. Is it function that's the dominant driver? Substrate compatibility? Or perhaps environmental exposure? Or compliance requirements? Or lastly, maybe operational constraints such as installation speed and reworkability. Understanding this helps align internal teams and reduces requalification cycles later on. Now with the last poll done, we're starting to wrap up. So let's take a look at what you should keep in mind when this webinar is over and you go back to your own projects. We'll highlight a few principles that consistently make the difference between smooth approvals and late-stage surprises. First off, reading the data. Understanding emissions data, VOC levels, and sustainability documentation is essential for making informed adhesive choices. Labels and certificates are really helpful, but we should not treat them as a full story. So let's look beyond the label and understand how was this data generated, which test methods were used, on which substrates, under which conditions. When data reflects real application conditions, it becomes a powerful tool for confident decision-making, rather than just a box-ticking exercise. We really need to make that shift from just checking, does it have the label, to asking ourselves, does this data truly represent how the product will perform in my application? Looking at test methods, aging conditions, and validation protocols helps avoid false assumptions and reduces the risk of performance gaps once the product is in use. Second takeaway, beware of common pitfalls. Many of the challenges we see in projects are not caused by missing technology, but by misinterpretation. Common pitfalls include misunderstanding certification requirements, overlooking substrate compatibility, or assuming that all low VOC technologies behave in the same way. Gaps in documentation, unverified performance on low surface energy materials, and inconsistent installation methods often lead to delays, requalification loops, or last-minute changes. If teams are aware of these pitfalls early on, it really helps avoid unnecessary friction later. And then lastly, the final takeaway is about applying a simple but structured approach. Start with the function, then validate against real environmental conditions. Ensure that compliance requirements are clearly understood and supported by the right documentation. And let's not forget operational fit, because even the best performing adhesive, if that complicates installation or converting, it will fail. Now with advanced acrylics and solvent-free platforms, it's possible to achieve both high performance and sustainability. The result? Faster approvals, cleaner installation, and more resilient, future-proof designs. So with that, I want to thank you for the questions that you've put in chat for us. If you still have any questions to add, please feel free to do so. And with that, we come to the end of this session. And the key message again, navigating Nordic standards does not have to mean added complexity. With the right understanding of regulations, labels, and application needs, sustainable adhesive choices can actually simplify approvals and operations. Now, innovation has long shaped Avery Dennison's approach, from the early development of self-adhesive labels to today with the advanced acrylic technologies. These next-generation solvent-free adhesives are already supporting cleaner, high-performance bonding across a wide range of industrial applications. Looking ahead, the roadmap moves toward a fully solvent-free portfolio by 2030. That's aligned with EU Green Deal objectives and evolving Nordic expectations. The focus here is really on helping customers reduce complexity, stay ahead of regulation, and design solutions that are built for long-term compliance and performance. If you're interested in discussing how these technologies may apply to your specific applications, our sustainability and R&D teams are available to continue the conversation. In fact, Jan will actually follow up with each of you individually to discuss any needs or questions you may have. Thank you for joining today's session. We appreciate your time and engagement, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.